Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack nearly 400 years of incredibly dense, dramatic history. We're looking at how the United States was formed, how it aggressively expanded, and how it fractured in what we can really only call the Great Experiment. We'll be tracing all the major events, starting from early colonization, going all the way through to the Gilded Age. Here is how we're going to break it all down today. We'll start with collision in the Americas, move into sparking the revolution, dive into the Great Experiment itself, look at the push westward, and finally wrap up with the Civil War and Reconstruction. All right, let's jump straight into part one, collision in the Americas. Because as we know, the New World definitely wasn't an empty land. So our story really kicks off way before 1776. The North American continent was already this vast, incredibly rich place, completely populated by complex native societies. But it was basically on a collision course with European imperial ambitions. Columbus sort of inadvertently opens up this whole new frontier back in 1492. Jump to 1607, and you've got the English establishing their first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia, which honestly was a really harsh, disease-filled start. Then, just 12 years later, in 1619, we hit a very grim milestone. The first enslaved Africans are brought to Virginia by English privateers, and practically right on the heels of that, in 1620, the Pilgrims arrive, seeking religious freedom and establishing Plymouth. Now, to truly grasp the horrific human cost of this era, we really have to pause and look at this number, 2 million. It's just staggering. Driven by the massively lucrative triangle trade, trading sugar and rum, the transatlantic slave trade just exploded. Between 1751 and 1775 alone, more than 2 million enslaved people were forced into the Americas. Okay, moving on to part two, sparking the revolution. And this is really all about the massive cost of maintaining a global empire. Here's a really fascinating paradox for you. The British and the American colonists actually fought side by side to win the huge French and Indian War in 1763. So, how does winning a war directly cause those exact same colonies to turn around and revolt? Well, it basically comes down to one absolutely crippling problem: war debt. To pay off that enormous global war, the British Parliament kicked off this rapid-fire domino effect of taxes. First, they hit him with the Sugar Act, then the Stamp Act, which taxed official paper and even playing cards of all things. The colonists were furious, arguing they had the rights of British citizens. That's where we get that famous rallying cry, right? No taxation without representation. This whole powder keg finally exploded in 1773 when the Sons of Liberty dumped 342 crates of East India Company tea straight into Boston Harbor. Britain struck back hard with the punishing Intolerable Acts, and by April 1775, agitated colonists were officially pushed into armed revolution at Lexington and Concord. And out of all that bloody rebellion emerged a genuinely revolutionary idea. Drafted mostly by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, this declaration totally shifted the goalposts from a simple rebellion to a full-on fight for a sovereign nation. But, and this is absolutely crucial to remember, these high-minded ideals of equality stood in this incredibly dark, deeply conflicted contrast with the actual reality of chattel slavery. In fact, it was such an intense conflict that an anti-slavery clause was completely struck from the original drafts. Which brings us to part three, the Great Experiment. Because now, they had to build a government entirely from scratch. So, George Washington's Continental Army finally forces a British surrender at Yorktown, but suddenly they have a brand new headache. How on earth do you govern a country that has literally never existed before? The messy initial reality was the Articles of Confederation. It created a central government that was just so weak it couldn't even handle domestic uprisings. So in 1787, leaders met in Philadelphia to just scrap the whole thing. They drafted a brand new constitution, building a structured authority that famously derived its ultimate power from the people.
But honestly, the ink was barely dry on that document before this young nation totally fractured into two super bitter political factions. On one hand, you had the Federalists, folks like Alexander Hamilton, pushing really hard for a powerful, centralized government. On the flip side were the Anti-Federalists. They were absolutely terrified that this new federal power would just turn into King George 2.0, so they fought fiercely to protect state rights. To prevent that exact kind of tyranny, the founders cooked up this brilliant system of checks and balances across three branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. And let me tell you, this framework was put to the test almost immediately. I mean, during the War of 1812, invading British forces quite literally set fire to the U.S. Capitol and the White House. Yet, somehow, the system survived. It proved that this great experiment could withstand some pretty incredible shocks.
All right, let's look at part 4, the push westward, and specifically the steep price of continental expansion. As the Republic survived its really turbulent infancy, this explosive, almost ravenous desire for new land totally took hold. Right at the core of this was manifest destiny. And this wasn't just some political slogan. It was an incredibly potent ideology. Americans genuinely deeply believed that they were divinely meant to spread their values and borders all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. But of course, that grand expansionist dream came with a devastating human cost. To clear land for white settlers, President Andrew Jackson rammed through the 1830 Indian Removal Act. This forced displacement of Native Americans across the Mississippi River resulted in an estimated 15,000 deaths. It's a brutal, heartbreaking journey that we now forever know as the Trail of Tears. Driven by this idea of destiny, the U.S. was basically gobbling up territory at lightning speed. Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase literally doubled the size of the country overnight. Then, the Mexican-American War yielded this massive swath of the Southwest, which happened right in time for the wildly lucrative 1848 California gold rush. And to cap it all off, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad physically united the country. What used to be a dangerous months-long wagon journey suddenly took less than a week. A total game changer. This brings us to our final chapter, Part 5, Civil War and Reconstruction. Because, well, a house divided cannot stand. So here's the breaking point. This incredibly rapid, seemingly triumphant Western expansion inevitably tore the United States apart at the seams. You see, for decades, politicians had basically just been kicking the can down the road when it came to slavery, using these temporary, fragile compromises. But now, every single time a new territory was added, it forced this unavoidable question that threatened the whole balance of power in Congress. Is this new land going to be slave or free? Looking at it chronologically, you can literally watch the dominoes falling straight toward war. The 1820 Missouri Compromise basically just drew a line on a map. But fast forward to 1854 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act lets settlers actually vote on the issue. That sparks a bloody mini-civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. Tensions skyrocketed from there, especially with radical abolitionist John Brown's raid in 1859. Then, the real tipping point. Abraham Lincoln gets elected in 1860, and southern states immediately start seceding. By April 1861, Confederate forces bombard Fort Sumter, and the Civil War is officially on. The Great Experiment very nearly destroyed itself. 600,000 lives. Just let that staggering casualty count sink in for a second. That was the ultimate tragic price paid to keep the nation unified. Through absolute, grinding, total war strategies by Union generals like Grant and Sherman, the North finally forced the Confederacy to surrender. But arguably the most crucial pivot happened under Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The war's purpose completely shifted. It wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. It fundamentally became about destroying the institution of slavery. Rising from the ashes of that total war, Lincoln sets the stage for Reconstruction. Though, tragically, he was assassinated just days after the surrender. The government steps in and passes 3 absolutely monumental constitutional amendments. Their goal? To reshape civil rights in America forever. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th guaranteed equal protection, and the 15th secured voting rights for black men. And for a brief time, all of this was backed by the occupation of federal troops down in the South. I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to ponder today. In 1877, a backroom political compromise gave Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency. The catch? He had to withdraw those federal troops from the South, which effectively abandoned Reconstruction. Now, this ushered in the booming wealth of the Gilded Age, sure, but it also directly opened the door to the systemic, awful oppression of Jim Crow. So we have to ask, did America actually fulfill its founding promises of equality, or did it simply begin a completely new, complex chapter of struggle? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.